All right. Just a brief review of what we've taken a look at in the Old Testament. I suggested that the way to see the Old Testament in overview could be in terms of four M's. I mentioned those last time. The mission of God, the method of the mission, the managers of the mission, and then the meltdown of the mission. The mission of God is that we are all made in the image of God. We are the children of God. Whatever our race, country, nationality, language, we are all the children of God. God wants all of God's children to be in connection with the Creator, with our God, but that is broken down. We see that in Genesis. We jump into the story, in the middle of the story, with the people of Israel. Why this people? We'll learn that a little bit later, but what God intends to do is to take this particular group of people, this family of the descendants of Abram, and place them in a unique spot on planet Earth at that time, which is centrally located for all of the communications and interaction among the nations. This small group of people will be given a special connection with God through the covenant, taught how to respond to God, who God is, what God's identity and mission is all about, and how they're to partner with God in reaching all of the rest of God's children. The backstory to that is that the world God created, Genesis 1, was intended to be a place for those made in the image of God, the children of God, those who have the capacities, some of the capacities, we call them attributes of God, the ability to love, to create, to manage, to share, to interact, to all of those things. We squandered that ability for whatever reasons are there in Genesis, but out of self-interest, we made it impossible for ourselves any longer to be completely connected with God. And God alone is the one who can remedy that situation. The pandemic of sin has entered this world, and we've all become less than truly human. We've become sort of like those who live in a zombie land world where people look sort of human-like, but the essence of their relationship with God is no longer there. God is seeking to remedy that situation and bring all of God's children home, and he does so through the people of Israel planted in that strategic location. The Old Testament has basically three kinds of literature. I've called them covenant making, covenant living, and covenant questions. The foundation is covenant making, where God establishes that unique missional relationship with Israel through the covenant and the planting of these people on the slope of, or the shores of the Mediterranean Sea. The second group of literature is what I call covenant living. It's often called the prophets in the Old Testament. These are the storytellers and the preachers who help guide God's people to live through history as the special missional people of God. The former prophets are more historians. The latter prophets are more preachers and teachers. And then there's the third set of literature in the Old Testament. I call it covenant questions. We often refer to it as wisdom literature or as poetry, in which the people begin to probe the dynamics of this relationship. Why do I suffer? How do I communicate with God? What is wisdom? What is the meaning of life? What is true love? What's it like to be a partner with God in this great enterprise, and to lose heart and to lose hope? Those are the kinds of things. Now, in the Old Testament, the mission of God was managed by a number of different people. There was Moses, the one who sort of took the people from Egypt to Sinai and up to the Promised Land. There was the second manager, that was Joshua, who brought the people into the land. There were the elders that Joshua instructed, look after the people after I'm gone, and they did so, but they too died. Then came the judges, sort of one-off leaders who were appointed at various times as enemies came in and the curses of the covenant kicked in. The last of those judges is really Samuel, and during his time, Israel was transitioned to a new form of management or leadership, and that was the kings. Samuel appoints the first two kings of Israel, Saul and David. Saul, the king they really want but shouldn't have, and David, the king that they really need, the man after God's own heart. Not perfect by any stretch of the imagination, but someone who gives a sense of direction to the people of God. Always Yahweh remains the true king of Israel. Following David's death, Solomon takes over, builds the temple. God moves into the temple from the tabernacle, and everything goes on well. In the Old Testament, there are several different major enemies of the Israelites. The first one we encounter in a big way is the Philistines during the time of Saul and David. The two of them together bring an end to the rule of the Philistines over the people of Israel. We have a number of small ones in the time of the Judges. But then after the Philistines, Israel becomes the dominant kingdom in the ancient Near East. During that time, the kings then will be the managers of this kingdom. And when they fail in their enterprise, seen particularly in the coming of Elijah and Elisha during the time of Ahab and Jezebel, it's the prophets who take over. They become the last major managers of God's mission in the Old Testament, and we'll see them coming right to the end of the Old Testament. After the Philistines were conquered, the next major threat to Israel was the Assyrians. And the Assyrians eventually would take over the northern kingdom after the kingdom was divided, and by 722 BC, they would destroy the northern tribes. All that was really left was Judah, along with most of the Levites and most of Benjamin after the difficult times at the end of the book of Judges. So this becomes the remnant of Israel. The Assyrians miraculously are prevented from taking over the people of Judah, but later on, as the managers, the kings, continue their downward slide, their meltdown, it will be the Babylonians who come in, and they will destroy Jerusalem and the city and the temple in the city of Jerusalem, and they will take whoever survives the onslaught into captivity, a truly displaced people. The destruction of Jerusalem takes place in 586 BC. The northern tribes are gone. Now we have a remnant of the people of Judah in Babylon. This is the time of Jeremiah and Ezekiel and Daniel. The people in Babylon will survive, and the Persians will conquer the Babylonians in 539 BC, initiating a process by which these displaced people will be allowed to return home. This will be the return from exile. We'll see this in the book of Ezra and Nehemiah. We'll hear about these things from a different vantage point in the book of Esther. We'll also read about this in the prophets Haggai and Zechariah, Malachi, and Joel. The Old Testament will come to an end around the middle of the 5th century, the 400s, 450 we think is about the time of Malachi. And a little bit later, probably the prophecies of Joel. The prophecies of Joel happen at a time when there's a great plague of locusts, and people are saying, wow, this must be the end of the world. But Joel will say to them, no, this isn't it, but take note of these things because the end will come. But it won't be a total annihilation or destruction. And the prophets will speak about the day of the Lord, the day of visitation, the day of judgment, that day, the coming day. And all of that will be an indication that because of the meltdown of Israel, the inability of Israel to continue to be a partner with Yahweh in this divine missional emphasis, this desire to bring all of God's children back home again, eventually God will have to step into human society once again, like God did in Egypt, bringing the Israelites out. Now God will have to step in once again and make the thing work, because Israel has not been able to make the thing work. That day of the Lord will involve three major elements, said the prophets. One would be judgment, judgment on the nations, judgment on Israel for her sinfulness. There would be the sparing of a remnant that would move through into the third thing, the Messianic age, in which there would be a restoration of the creation in the manner in which God had intended, and a renewal of the relationship between God and all God's children from every tribe, language, nation, and people on earth. But that would be the process. Now, what happened there? We saw that the anticipation was coming. The prophet Malachi, God spoke through him and said that I'm going to come very soon. Judgment will come with me. I'll send my prophet Elijah to prepare the way. The prophet Joel said that the judgment would come and there would be devastation and darkness, but then there would be the remnant spared, and then the Spirit of God would be poured out on all of humankind. Well, what took place is that after the Persians took over the Babylonian kingdom and they took over the ancient Near East, largest kingdom ever up until that time, they took over all the way to Greece. They tried to conquer Greece as well, but in that process, they prodded this little tiny giant, and Philip of Macedonia became the one who would amalgamate the Greek city-states, and he would lead them on a return engagement. The Persians poured into Greece twice over, in 490 BC and then in 480 BC. First time in 490 BC under Darius I, Darius the Great. They lost against the Greeks in the Battle of Marathon. They poured in the second time under Darius's son Xerxes, or Ahasuerus, the king of Esther's book. And in 480 BC, he would try again, but he would be thwarted at the pass of Thermopylae, where the 300 Spartans would hold them for a while, and then they would eventually meet defeat in the Battle of the Bay of Salamis, where the Greek ships would outmaneuver the Persian ships and basically destroy the whole fleet. This would give rise to the Greeks, and under Philip of Macedonia and his son Alexander, there was a desire by the Greeks to move back into Persia and to punish them and to take over their territory. The Greeks had been mainly somewhat disaffiliated city-states up until that time, but it was Philip and Alexander who welded the Greeks into a modern empire that could take on other nations. Alexander began his quest to take over Persia in the mid-300s. By 329, he had defeated the Persians on a number of fronts in what we now call Turkey. He was headed for Persia, but he wanted along the way to get himself identified as the Pharaoh of Egypt. This is a strange thing, but this is part of Alexander's megalomania. He really believed he was the greatest. I mean, truly the greatest person who's ever lived anywhere, of all nations, any place. And so he wanted to be declared the Pharaoh of Egypt as well. Now, Egypt was under the control of Persia. In order to get from Turkey, as we know it today, or Asia Minor, to Egypt, he had to pass through the Levant, the land of Syria, the land of old Israel, the land of Judah, down to the Nile Delta, to Egypt. And in order to do that, he came through what was now Judea, the people, the returned peoples of the Jews. The Jews the people of Judah after the exile were called the Jews, and some of them had returned home, and many were still scattered among the nations. But the nation of Judah was now reestablished, and the people were called the Jews. Well, everybody was scared of Alexander, and rightly so, because his war machine was second to none. He was coming to take on the Persians. He was going to do that. 329 BC, he came through Palestine, and in order to circumvent his destruction of the land, the high priest at that time, Jaddua the high priest, this is in Josephus' Antiquities of the Jews, he took the book of Daniel and he carried it out dressed in his high priestly garb, and with him all the priests and the Levites and the people following them, and they met Alexander along the seacoast. And they showed to Alexander the book of Daniel, and we remember what was going on there. indications that there would be 4 successive kingdoms, and it was Babylon that was the first, Persia that was the second, and Greece that was the third. This is Alexander's Greece. So in the very religious books, the scriptures of the Jews, we find the anticipations of Alexander the Great. And Alexander, of course, was very happy about this. And so he took over, he annexed the people of Judah without ever carrying on a staged battle. He marched into Jerusalem with them in peace. He didn't kill anybody. He worshiped Yahweh, probably in his mind, Zeus in the temple. He didn't desecrate anything, and he moved on his way. He went down to Egypt, and there, after some maneuvering and some massive gifts, he managed to get himself to be identified as the Pharaoh of Egypt. Now he's taken over what's Asia Minor, that is the area of Turkey today. He's taken over the coastline, he's taken over Egypt, then he marches on Persia itself. Along the way, he manages to defeat the Persian armies. He marries a Persian princess, has a son, names the son Alexander, and then he marches on further into what we now call Afghanistan and to Pakistan and to India. He marches into all those places, and then he gets kind of mired down because there are elephants there, and his men have never seen elephants before. And there's tough going through swamplands and tropical regions. And his men finally say, enough is enough. We've been gone from home more than 10 years. It's time to go back. And reluctantly, Alexander the Great turns around and he marches his troops back. He gets as far as Babylon, ancient Babylon, which is in ruins. There's no city standing there, but the ruins are still there. He gets there in 323 BC, and he celebrates his 33rd birthday. He's 33 years old, 323 BC. He celebrates his birthday, and he dies. He never gets back home. Did he die of poisoning? Did he die of a disease that he caught? Did he die, some say, of aspirating his vomit because he drank too much on his birthday? We don't know. The jury is still out on why exactly Alexander the Great died at the age of 33 in 323 BC, but he died in Babylon, saying that he was disappointed that there were no more worlds to conquer. Well, his generals knew that he had a son, a young son named Alexander, but they knew that the son was the son of Alexander and his Persian princess. So they decided that he was not worthy to become the Greek emperor or king, and so they divided Alexander's kingdom among themselves in 4 quadrants. 2 of the quadrants in the east were based in what would become known as Antioch or Antakya in Syria today, and the other one in Alexandria, Egypt. It would be called the Ptolemaic kingdom, the Ptolemies. In Antioch, it would be the Seleucids, General Seleucids. So there are 2 different generals of Alexander that take over the eastern section of his kingdom. What happens is that this 4-part kingdom will continue to be in existence. There will never again be a Greek monarch, and eventually the Romans will come in and take over the entire Greek kingdom. So it limps its way out. But for our purposes, the 2 generals, Seleucus in Antioch and Ptolemy in Alexandria, become the key figures in the development of Palestine, where the Jews live, many of the Jews. They're still scattered among the nations, but the heartbeat, the homeland of the Jews, is still in Judea, and Jerusalem is its central city, and the temple has been rebuilt. Well, what happens over time is that the Jews grow in numbers, and they begin to establish themselves among the nations of the ancient Near East once again. They don't have a king. They still are under the Persians, and then they're under the Greeks, so the others are ruling them. But they begin to be tussled back and forth between the Antiochids up in Antioch, the Seleucids, and the Ptolemies down in Egypt. For most of 100 years, the Ptolemies of Egypt own and operate Palestine. And they do so rather benignly, sort of hands off. Whatever the Jews want to do is fine. Just pay the tributes, pay the taxes, and we'll be fine with it. In Palestine itself, the Jews begin to polarize themselves in two directions. Some want to become modern Jews and become part of this modern society and speak Greek and stop circumcising the boys who then could play with the other teams in the sports arenas. And others want to become more and more strict Jews. They want to return to the old ways and make sure that all of the old things are practiced and established, and maybe even speak Hebrew. Presently, they're speaking Aramaic, but maybe get back to Hebrew. Well, that tension begins to grow, and eventually one of the Seleucid emperors will take advantage of that. Emperor Antiochus III is the first one to take over Palestine, and he decides that the Ptolemies no longer have it, it's his. He really wants to take over the whole Ptolemaic kingdom, and he's on his way to do this, but he takes hold of Palestine first. He dies, and eventually it'll be one of his successors, Antiochus IV. Antiochus, who calls himself Epiphanes, that is God manifest. If you see me, you see God. But he's called by others behind his back Antiochus Epimanes, which means madman. And he's truly that. He also is megalomaniac. He believes himself to be like Alexander the Great, the only one who's ever going to take over the world entirely. Well, during that time, he manages to fully take over Palestine from the Ptolemies. The last of the Ptolemies will be Cleopatra, who we know from history as the one who has affairs with Julius Caesar, and then Brutus as well. Mark Antony as well, and then dies in that tragic scene we know from Shakespeare. But in Palestine, Antiochus IV, he comes in and he basically takes over. And he takes over in a huff. Then he goes on to Egypt, and he wants to further consolidate his hold over the Ptolemaic Greeks, and he manages to conquer Egypt as well. Now, the rumors come surfacing about his possible death during that campaign into Egypt. And he decides that he's very much still alive. And then his beloved Romans, he loves the Romans. The Romans decide that they're going to expand their kingdom to the east. They own all of the western part of the Mediterranean Sea and the surrounding lands, but they want to move east, and they're growing in numbers and power. And reluctantly, Antiochus IV, sticks his tail between his legs, hangs his head, and moves back. But he is angry. He's angry with the Romans for telling him to get out of the land he just conquered, and he is angry with the Jews for being so hard to control and for now circulating a rumor that he's dead. So he storms into Jerusalem. He takes over the temple in 158 BC. He takes, or 168 BC, I'm sorry. He takes over the temple, he takes over Jerusalem, and he desecrates it. He puts up in the temple a large image of himself and demands that the Jews worship him and worship that statue. And then he forces all of the priests all over the land to sacrifice pigs, which are unclean and not kosher, and to eat pig meat. Well, this doesn't go over very well. And when he sends his soldiers out throughout the country to enforce his actions, they get to a little country town named Modin, about 8 miles away from Jerusalem. And the priest, the older priest there, Mattathias, refuses to sacrifice pigs or eat pork. And a younger priest steps in and says, I'll do it. And Mattathias gets very upset, and he takes a sword and he kills his fellow priest. And that is the start of the Jewish rebellion. This older priest has 5 sons. Well, he has 4 at this time because one of his sons has already died. It's the third of his sons, Judas, who will lead the troops, who will kind of muster the Jews and take on the Greeks out of Antioch. It'll be a fierce battle, not a pitched battle in big open areas, but rather guerrilla strikes from the hills. And because these guerrilla strikes come with hammer-like intensity, Judas is called the hammerer. That in the Aramaic language is the term Maccabeus. And that's where the idea of Judas Maccabeus comes in. And that's where we have the books of 1st, 2nd, 3rd, and 4th Maccabees in the Apocrypha of the Bible, books that were written about these wars against the invading Greeks. Well, the war takes 3 years, and the people manage finally to take back Jerusalem 3 years after it was desecrated by Antiochus. And when they get into the temple area, the menorah lamp is still burning. Now that's really something, because the oil for the menorah in the temple in Jerusalem was special oil, pressed out of olives and specially blessed by the high priest. And of course, during the 3 years since the invasion, they've not had a time to do that. So quickly they go about the process of crushing more olives for oil and getting them blessed. But it's an 8-day process. And by the time they get the temple cleaned up, it's 8 days after they've managed to liberate Jerusalem. And during those 8 days, the menorah flame has not gone out. They call it a miracle. And that becomes the start of the festival of Hanukkah, the festival of lights. If you have Jewish neighbors or friends, relatives or whatever, they celebrate Hanukkah, the festival of lights, celebrating the 8 nights that the menorah lamp did not go out, even though the oil was basically gone. The oil is replenished, the temple is cleansed, the Jews sue for independence, they gain it, they become an independent nation for 100 years, from about 164 BC down to 63 BC. During that time, these Maccabees, because they have been the deliverers of the Jews, they basically function as the high priests. They weren't actually the high priests, but they took over the role of being the high priest. They moved to Jerusalem. They took over the rule of the temple. Then they added to that the right to be kings. So they declared themselves to be kings. You have a priestly family that takes over the role of high priest, not supposed to do that, but they did anyway. And then they declare themselves to be kings. And that is really not appropriate. And the Jews become mixed about this. Those who are aligning themselves with the Maccabees, they're a succession of brothers. Judas is the one first, and then Jonathan, and then Simon. They all become, or Simon and then Jonathan, and they in succession take over the rule, and then they pass it down to their families. These brothers and their descendants become known as the Zadok priests, righteous priests, priests of righteousness. And they will, in time, that term Zadok priest will kind of be crunched into the name Sadducee. So the Sadducees at Jesus' time are the end product of this revolt of the Jews under Judas Maccabeus and the rise of the independence of the Jews for 100 years. Now, as they take over the kingdom, there are many who sort of push back against them and say they're no longer truly the historic devout Jews. These will be the ones who will take the rules for purification from the temple, and they'll begin to apply these things to their daily lives, including washings and cleansings and food preparation. And over time, these more lay people, devout lay people, will gain a name too. They will be called the separatists or the separated ones, and their name will become known as Pharisees. So you have the Sadducees and the Pharisees, the two dominant groups that will become part of the Jewish landscape at the time of Jesus. Now, the family of Hasmoneans, that's Mattathias' family and his sons and their descendants, they become the Sadducees and the priests and the kings for a time. They hold sway over the people. And because there's tension within and among the Jews, the stability of that 100-year-long independence comes into question. Over down in Edom, it's now called Idumea, the king Sosipater is someone who is looking at all of this, and he likes the Romans, and he thinks that the Romans should come and they should put an end to all of the social unrest among the Jews. Well, Antipater gets his grandson, a young man named Herod, to date one of the descendants of the Maccabees. He marries into the Jewish high priest family an Edomite who becomes a part of the Jewish high priestly and kingship family. And because of his place there, he gets to be declared king, and he invites in the Romans to take over and confirm his kingship. Now, this is totally inappropriate. But that man, that young man, becomes Herod the Great. And the Jews do not like him. And so what he does is he becomes a strong man, and he starts building projects right, left, and center. The Herodium, Masada, places all over Palestine that you can go to today and find these great ruins. Caesarea, these are all made by Herod the Great. Caesarea was a town that didn't exist along the Mediterranean seacoast, and he just made a town, made a city, made a harbor there where there was no harbor. He did all of these things. And especially to get into the good graces of the Jews, he did a rebuilding project on the temple. Remember that in Ezra 1 through 6, they finally, after a few years, managed to get Solomon's temple rebuilt, only it was nothing like the original. It was a small temple. It had none of the grandeur of the old one. Herod the Great decides that he's going to be the one who builds the new temple. He rebuilds the temple, even while it is being used, continuously rebuilds it for a number of years until he finishes it shortly before Jesus is born. And the temple, the second temple in Jerusalem, is supposedly bigger and better, at least as big and at least as beautiful as Solomon's temple, and some say it even exceeded Solomon's temple. This is the temple that Jesus and his disciples will wander through. This is the temple that Paul will worship at. This is the temple that's existing in the time of the New Testament, and it rivals or exceeds the glory and the grandeur of Solomon's temple. So that's in place. Herod himself turns over the kingdom to his sons in 4 BC, but he doesn't die until about 0. Just before Jesus is born, or right at the time that Jesus is born. So Jesus is likely born a few months before what we would say is the year 0. And you remember the story from Matthew's gospel, we'll get into that, how the wise men come, they've seen the bright light in the skies, the star that announces a king's birth, and they'll come to Herod in Jerusalem and ask where the new king is born. Obviously, Herod, a very old man at this time, says, I haven't got any new kids being born. And he consults with the wise men or with the sages in the kingdom, and they talk about Micah's prophecy that the king would be born from David's stock in Bethlehem. So that's the story that happens then. Well, Herod dies at just before what we would call 0, just after Jesus is born, and that will lead to the New Testament age. Now, once the Hasmoneans, once the Maccabees had recovered independence for the Jews, there was a sudden resurgence of Jewish migration, especially from Babylon and Persia. Many of the Jews, like Esther and Mordecai, had stayed on in Persia and Babylon. But many of them, now knowing that there was independence for the Jews, came back. And so there was a rapid rise of population in Palestine. First, they came to Jerusalem, and many of the first comers, they believed that because of independence, this was the time that Messiah would come. And so they were just waiting for Messiah to show up. But they got to Jerusalem and found that it was really a dirty and corrupt city. And so many of them moved out to the wilderness to the east and south of Jerusalem, and they became known as the Essenes. You can read about them in Josephus as well. They were separatists, and they were really holy people. They copied the scriptures, prayed and waited for Messiah to come. They even lived in separate quarters, men in one building and women in another, and they were about to die out like the Quakers in the United States. They didn't think that marriage was to be had among them, and so they copied scriptures and they hid them. This is the source of what we know today as the Dead Sea Scrolls. These were copied by the Essenes along the Dead Sea during the time, the first 100 years or so, 150 years before Jesus was born. The Essenes had an effect on the people of that region, and John the Baptist was thought to be kind of wild and from the wilderness. He likely lived by and perhaps with and perhaps among the Essenes for a time, and was sort of an Old Testament prophet-like guy. You might say he was the last of the Old Testament prophets, but he was likely heavily influenced by the Essenes and calling for God to send the end times and the Redeemer, the Messiah to come. All of that is echoed in what John the Baptist preaches about, and that Messiah would come very quickly. There was also other groups in Jewish society at that time. Some were leaning in the direction of the Romans and the Greeks and wanting the Jews to become modern, stop circumcising the boys. And, you know, there's only one God, call him Yahweh, call him Zeus if you want. Let's just move into the Greek world and become Hellenized. So they were on the other side of the Sadducees. They wanted to make the Jewish world more Greek, be part of the modern world. On the other side of the Essenes were the Zealots. These were, generally the Pharisees were not militaristic, not in that shape. They were not militant. They didn't want to go to war, but they would. There were times when the Pharisees actually took up arms, but generally not. But the Zealots did. They were really the terrorists among the Jews of that day. They didn't know anything about explosives, so they didn't wear explosive vests or anything like that, or bombs. But they did do what they could to get rid of the Romans who were now quartered in Palestine. They were actively seeking ways of fighting back, and they were actively involved in assassination plots. In fact, some of them carried little knives, little curved blade knives that were called the Sicarii, and these people were called the Sicarii themselves. They were the assassins who would mingle in crowds, and if there was a Roman soldier, they would, in the secrecy of the mob, they would take out this little knife, they would cut the carotid artery of the Roman soldier and just slip away in the crowds and let him fall to the earth and bleed out. These were the assassins. They were the Sicarii. Way over on the other side, completely in line with both the Greeks and the Romans, were the Herodians. Now, we meet several of these groups in the New Testament, in the Gospels. We see prominently the Pharisees, And it's likely that most of Jesus' disciples were Pharisees. Paul later would claim to be a Pharisee, even after he's a Christian. Acts chapter 22, he says to the people in Jerusalem, I too am a Pharisee. So he says, even as a Christian, he's a Pharisee. These were the good guys. We should not think of them as bad guys. Jesus had plenty of bad words for them, but the words that Jesus had for the Pharisees were basically there because they were good and devout, and they knew it. They knew they were good, and that's what Jesus had against them. The greatest threat against righteousness is to know that you are righteous and become proud of it. They were proud that they were more righteous than others. Jesus even teaches a story about that, the Pharisee and the tax collector in the temple. So that was the problem with the Pharisees. But by and large, Jesus and his disciples were Pharisees. Now, among them, though, were a couple of others who even pushed into that area of being the terrorists. There was Simon the Zealot. He's identified as a zealot. And the Zealots wanted to work actively to return independence to the Jews and see the coming of the kingdom. Jesus' own disciples will talk with Jesus about that several times. There's also Judas. Judas is called Iscariot, which could be from a place, but it's also possible that he is a Sicarii. That's more than likely the case. So that Simon the Zealot and Judas Iscariot were two who were so far right on the spectrum that they were the terrorists among the disciples of Jesus who wanted in any active way to kill and get rid of the Romans by force. And this may even explain why Judas did what Judas did. He probably was enamored by Jesus because Jesus came with power, signs, wonders, miracles. Obviously, he was on the side of heaven. He spoke about the kingdom of heaven. He said things that indicated that he was bringing in the kingdom. The kingdom is not of this world, but look inside of yourselves. He said that he was the one to lead the charge. He and the Father were one. Judas was as enamored as anybody by Jesus and was waiting for Jesus probably to be the next Judas Maccabeus and bring freedom from the Roman enemies to the Jews. And then Jesus didn't go far enough. Jesus began to play games with the children. He began to sit at table with rich people and tax collectors and prostitutes. And Judas said, man, the guy's getting off track. And in his desire to push Jesus back onto track, to bring in the revolution, bring in the kingdom, he probably wanted to foment this rebellion against Jesus, not because he wanted to get rid of Jesus, but rather in order that Jesus would be kind of shocked back into reality and would say to the disciples, oh yeah, that's right, guys, take out your swords. Let's get this show on the road and let's take over the kingdom. And Jesus didn't do that. And Jesus was killed horribly. And it seemed like the whole thing was crumbling. And that's why Judas probably took his own life. But there's the landscape at the time that Jesus was born. The Greeks were the last of the major kingdoms to take over peaceably. The Persians and the Greeks didn't do much to change the life of the Jews. In fact, they helped the Jews recover their Jewish identity. But the last of the Greeks began to meddle in the life and affairs of the Jews. During that time, Judas Maccabeus and the Hasmonean family became the deliverers of the Jews, and for 100 years the Jews had independence. Then, unfortunately, the enemies of the Jews, the Edomites, Antipater, married into the family of the Hasmoneans. Herod the Great became their king, and the Romans took over. So the world at the time of the birth of Jesus was one that had changed again, but it was in continuity with all that came before. Now, in the New Testament, the writings of the New Testament happen in a very short time. The writings of the Old Testament take place over about 1,000-year period. From about 1300 BC, when the Israelites leave Egypt and the covenant documents are written at Mount Sinai and beyond, through the time of the historians and the psalmists and the poets and the prophets, down to Joel, probably 325 or 350 BC, close to the time that the Greeks come into the area. But the New Testament is written in about a 50-year period. It will begin, the first pieces of the New Testament will be Paul's letter to the Galatians, written probably in 49 AD, and the last of the writings of the New Testament is likely to be either Revelation or the epistles of John, or perhaps the Gospel of John, the writings of John. All three of these probably sometime in the 80s and 90s of the first century, meaning that the entire New Testament is written in about 50 years. Now, I'm nearly 71. The entire New Testament could have been written easily within my lifetime. So it's a very short period of time. The Gospels were not written first. The Gospels were written after Paul's letters for the most part, or at the time of Paul's last letters. Following them, the letters of Peter and Jude, and then last we have Hebrews just before the fall of Jerusalem, and then the writings of John probably in the 80s and 90s. So that's the relative dating of the New Testament. But we're going to be looking at the Gospels first, because the Gospels are the ones that tell us the story of Jesus. And of course, the story of Jesus comes before we have the story of the letters and the travels of Paul. So we'll be looking at that first. Now, among the writers of the Gospels, we'll look at each. It is very likely that the Gospel of Mark was written first, and it's essentially the preaching of Peter about Jesus while in Rome. That'll be written probably in the mid to late 50s, and then both Matthew and Luke will make use of Mark's Gospel, as Matthew writes an expanded version for the Jewish Christians, and Luke writes an expanded version for the Gentile Christians who come to faith under the ministry of Paul. Luke will add to his Gospel the book of Acts, which will give us the story of the early church. He'll consider that all to be the story of Jesus in the flesh, and then the story of Jesus through the Spirit. John will write his Gospel much later, and the letters of Peter and Jude and the book of Hebrews will be written somewhere in the 60s, very likely, before the fall of Jerusalem. There was, at the time of Jesus, there were two collections of what were identified as scripture. One was the books we call the the covenant, the Torah, and the second was the prophets, former and latter. What was not yet solidified at that time was the writings that we call the poetry and others. And so at the time of Jesus, we have the law and the prophets together as scripture. But then we have this larger collection of writings called the writings. That won't be solidified in its form for the Jewish Bible until after the temple falls, Jerusalem falls in 70 AD. And that's why some of the Bibles, particularly those of the Roman Catholics and the Eastern Orthodox, continue to make use of the expanded collection of writings, and the Protestants at the time of the Reformation, who focused especially on the scriptures as authoritative, the Protestants went with the Jewish Old Testament. So we'll see those things coming together when we see the writings of the New Testament and the writings of the Old Testament along with that.